in memory of our good friend, Mr. Bill Rubin, whose yard site was yesterday. The Day of Learning was sponsored by Shraga and Nancy Green of Baltimore, Maryland. Okay. Mishna, we're in Perek Bay, Mishnah Yisukah, Perek Bay's chapter 2, Mishnah Bay's Mishnah 2. Ha-saimech sukasai bekare hamita kashera. One who supports his sukkah by the boards of a bed, the sukkah is kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it cannot stand on its own, pesula, it is invalid. Now, what's happening is like this. This bed, the bed is outside the sukkah, and the schach is supported by one of the ends of the bed frame. So look at this picture. You can see it. Okay. You see there's the bed frame?
Yeah.
And it's up against the sukkah. So basically what you have here is that the bed frame is supporting one of the it's one of the walls, basically. It's one of the walls of the sukkah. And the schach is being supported by it. Okay? Now, the point here is like this, that essentially this sukkah will not remain standing for long because the bed is likely to be moved, causing the sukkah to collapse. Just practically speaking, it seems to me it was very common that they moved around the beds. It's not like they had a place for the bed to stay, and that was it. The bed was moved when they went to sleep. They had it in one place. After they finished going to sleep, they move it over to the side. So, but the point is that if this sukkah is being supported by the bed frame, and you move the bed, what happens to the sukkah? It collapses, it falls apart. So the Tanna Kama says, nonetheless, it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not kosher. And the way they explain is like this. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's invalid because Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah must have some permanence, right? Rabbi Yehuda, we've had a couple of times of the opinion that sukkah diras kva. A sukkah is meant to be made like a permanent structure. And therefore, if it's meant to be like a permanent structure, a structure that when you go ahead and move the bed is going to collapse is not a permanent structure, or somewhat of a permanent structure. Don't forget, it's not going to stay forever. It's only going to be up there for sukkahs. But nonetheless, it's still built in a stronger way that it has some level of permanence to it. Well, a sukkah that's supported by a bed where you're going to pull the bed away, the sukkah is going to come down, is not called permanent enough according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanna Kama, however, rules that it is valid because, in his opinion, a sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling. Sukkah diras haroi. A sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling. If a sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling, it doesn't make a difference that it's going to come down when you move away the bed. While the bed is there and it's up, it's a kosher sukkah. That's the first case in the Mishnah. Next case is sukkah hamaduvlelis. They translate as a uneven sukkah. Now, an uneven sukkah means that the schach is made in a way that it's not like schach is typically flat, right? Whether you have your mat, whether you have your bamboo sticks, at the end of the day, typically it's going to be all level, right? Next to each other, right? Now, branches are going to be sometimes a little bit whatever, but typically you have all the spaces filled, right? As much as possible. In this situation, the schach is laid in a way that you have, instead of it being, as I say, one flat layer, it is split into two layers with every other piece of schach at one height and all the remaining pieces at another height. So look at this picture. One's up, one's down. Okay, instead of
all in the same direction.
All in the same direction, but one is higher. What you have, what lower, higher, lower, higher, lower, higher, which means physically you've got spaces in between, right? Now, the issue here is like this. The issue here is that during most of the day, when the sun shines on the sukkah at an angle, the sukkah has more sunlight than shade, because the light shines through the gaps between the two levels of schach, right? You're going to have more sunlight than shade inside the sukkah. That's a problem typically, right? That should sound like a problem. However, the sukkah is nevertheless valid at all times because schach is judged by how much shade it provides when the sun is directly overhead. Since at that time the sukkah has more shade than sunlight, it is valid even during the rest of the day. Hear that part? The way they're bringing down, there's a couple of ways of explaining this Mishnah, but the way they're bringing down the Tosfos Yontiv is that when the sun is directly above, you're not going to have that problem. And since at that point you don't have that problem, that's enough to be a kosher sukkah. It doesn't have to be that all day long the shade is more than the sunlight. Even if it's a point of time because of where the sun is located in the sky, the light is going to be more than the shade. Nonetheless, the way they explain it here is that it because when the sun is directly overhead, it's going to provide more shade than sunlight, and therefore it's valid for the rest of the day. The way the Bar Tanura says it is, okay, the way he says it, and I'm not sure if this is a different understanding, but the way he says it is, even though they're situated, they're not even, we look at it as if they would be even. And if they would be even, would there be more shade than sunlight? The answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then it's kosher, even though now the way it's situated, you don't have that. That's the way that Bartanura says it. Bartanura says is that the way that, although right now the sunlight gets in, but if it would be lying next to each other, it would block this, it would block the sunlight enough. It's kosher right now also. And I don't know if they don't mention it here necessarily, but we're also talking about that wherever spaces are between the pieces of schach, they have to be less than 3 tfachim, because otherwise you're going to have an airspace problem, it would seem. All right, now, so that's the second case. Now, the next case is where its shade is more than its sunlight, kasher, it's kosher. Now that's pretty simple. We know that already before. What exactly is this case where they're talking about the shade is more than the sunlight? Okay, it's talking about the schach is very sparse, yet its shade is greater than its sunlight. It's kosher. Okay, it's very sparse, but the shade is more than the sunlight. It's good enough. In the first case, now they explain here. In the first case, where the schach is uneven, the sukkah is valid because we view the schach as though it were flat. Okay, that's the way the Bartanura says it. We view it as if it's flat, and the way that the Tosfos Yontiv they bring to here explains that we view it as if it's flat means because when it's overhead, it applies enough shade, it's more shade than sunlight, and therefore it's good. In the second case, where the schach is sparse, the sukkah is valid because the solid parts of the sukkah cover a greater area than the gaps. Meaning, there's two things here. Number one, you have to have the more shade than sukkah. I mean, there's enough schach there to supply more shade than sukkah, and there's more schach than gap. If total there's more schach than gap, then you're okay to go. All right. So they bring it on here number 5. The Mishnah teaches that even though the schach is so thin and sparse that it can easily be blown away by the wind, the sukkah is valid as long as it has more shade than sunlight. Doesn't have if it's time, even though it could be blown away. Right now it's there. Let's remember, a sukkah is meant to be a temporary building. It's meant to be a temporary roof. It's going to be kosher. Now, when the Mishnah says shade and sunlight, refers not to the shadows and sunlit areas on the floor of the sukkah, but to the solid schach materials and gaps on top of the sukkah. Okay, so that's what it means when we say. Okay, when the Mishnah says shade and sunlight in this case, right, where it says there is more shade than sunlight, they're saying it does not mean that it refers not to the shadows and sunlit areas on the floor of the sukkah, but to the solid schach materials and gaps on top of the sukkah. Okay. Meaning, more shade than sunlight means I have more schach than gaps. That's all it means. And therefore,
so if I'm looking up,
correct. If I have more of the filled-in area than the open area, then the halacha is that it's going to be it's going to be kosher. Okay. Okay, last case of the Mishnah, we have Hamuva Kamin Bayis. Let's say your sukkah is covered densely like a house. I mean, there's a lot of schach up there. A lot of schach. Okay. Even though you can't see the stars through it, you can't see the stars from the inside, it's valid. Now, the point would be that when you have so much schach, maybe it resembles the roof of a house. And the Chachamim would say, no good. The answer is no. It's not meant to be a roof. And maybe there'll be enough there that it can protect like a roof, but it's not meant to be a roof. The sage didn't disqualify it. At the same time, this is something that I think is commonly assumed. It is preferable, however, that the schach be laid in such a way that stars can be seen through it. You want to be able to see the stars through it. It's just that if you put up enough schach that you can't, it's still kasher. But the point is, though, that you should lay the schach in a way and at a quantity, let's call it, that you should be able to see the stars through the sukkah, through the schach. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I can never see the stars at noon during the day.